Building and Development. This is a recording of the Week 5 lecture. The objectives this week are to learn about the kinds of capital theorized to influence regional growth, explain a reason for and one criticism of economic growth as a policy goal, and then name at least one theory that can be applied to the regional community. Thinking about development in communities, of course, is part of an ethical responsibility. And social work has a grand challenge to reduce extreme economic inequality. And that also fits into the whole concept of economic growth. What is the relationship between economic growth and economic inequality? So this was the quiz questions. I'll skip over the muddiest points. Okay, so how can regions promote economic growth? Well, do you increase the population? So if you have more people, you have more people working, you have more people purchasing, more producers, more consumers. So if you have more people, you should have more growth. Do you increase land rents? If all the landlords raised the rents, then people would have to pay more. Would that lead to economic growth? Do you increase wages or income if we raised minimum wages, or if the market tightened and employers had to pay more for good employees? Then you'd have more money in workers' pockets, and then they would have more money to spend or invest. And so would that then lead to economic growth? So if you look here on job growth, and this is of course old, but the trend is probably the same. The red line is manufacturing, and you can see that that's going down. And then what's going up are things like education and medical services, and also business services, but not as much. Retail is kind of plateaued out, and then there's less going on in wholesale and construction. And then think, what does that mean for Detroit? Given Detroit's regional economy, how would we promote economic growth by looking at job trends and changing those? Why are we looking at regions? The idea is that the basic unit of the local economy is the region, not a city or a neighborhood. It's the place where you have an interdependence and a commuting shed. So it's basically, a region is the place that you can realistically drive to work, or if you're lucky enough to live in any, in a major city with mass transit, it would be the region connected by mass transit. These regions usually are aggregations of counties, and they often have some form of governance. In Detroit, it's called SEMCOG, the Southeast Michigan Council of Governments. That's a loose confederation. In other cities, like the Twin Cities, you actually have an elected regional government to manage things like transit, air quality, water quality, parks, etc. So here's some theories. One idea is this idea of agglomeration clustering. The idea is that if you bring a lot of people and firms together in one place, then you get more economic growth than if they're spread out. Then that has to do with some sort of economy of scale. It's more efficient to do business if you have to travel shorter distances. And so, another idea is that is related is that then if you have multiple jurisdictions in a region, then they compete, and then that encourages jurisdictions to be more efficient, and then that frees up more money for economic growth. So you could have a monocentric city as pictured here, where there's a dense downtown and then a less dense neighborhoods going out. But many cities, especially those out west, are polycentric, where there's sort of lots of mini downtowns all throughout the city. You could think of Metro Detroit as polycentric, where we have a job center in downtown Detroit, a job center in Auburn Hills, one in Warren. Maybe you would think of a job center in Royal Oak, um, and some other, maybe you would consider the job centers of Washtenaw County as part of a broader regional set of centers. So what are some of the other assumptions of economic development? The old-fashioned model is that if you want economic development, the government should provide funding to stimulate the economy, and that's called Keynesian development, and that goes back almost 100 years. And this is all part of a planned growth model that, if the government plans areas for redevelopment, and then the business will follow. So that philosophy dominated the early part of the 20th century. In the last quarter of the 20th century, we had the neoliberal model, which the idea there is that the government spending actually cuts off private investment. So if you want economic growth, you need to decentralize. You want federalism, where you want more autonomy for states. You want free trade. You want to deregulate. You want to cut taxes and privatize. And then this sort of competition between states and cities leads to an economic development philosophy that Rubin called shoot anything that flies, claim anything that falls. The idea that the market should decide, and all the city can do is hope that a business just flies overhead, and then they just grab onto it and hope it lands. Now, there are more recent philosophies, although this is getting on 20 years, the idea that actually the government can play a role in identifying strengths of a region, and then, being strategic about what businesses fit with the existing businesses, and a focus on growing existing businesses. These are some questions about that Ren Farley poses in the textbook on 20th century revitalization. And the first one kind of relates to my opening slide. If 14% in Michigan work in manufacturing compared to 8% in the United States, should we diversify, and how? And that's something to think about. Is the problem of Detroit one of lack of diversification? So how does capital matter? We have the different kinds of capital that we talked about: financial, human capital, education. Is that related to economic growth? Social capital, how might that be related to economic growth? If people bond more, does the economy grow? If people bridge to other groups, or if they link to institutions, does that grow the economy? And then we have the creative capital idea, that maybe what we need are a subset of human capital that involves creativity. And so how does that work? What is his name? Richard Florida. So his idea is that if you want economic growth, what he calls regional development, if you want your region to grow, you need technology, you need tolerance, and you need talent. You got to have all three. That's the idea. And then he tries to test this with a lot of statistics. He gets aggregate data on regions in the U.S., a measure for tolerance, a measure for universities, a measure for talent, for technology, like the number of patents and whatnot, and then income and wages at the end. And he has some scatter plots, which you can look at your leisure. And then look, all these asterisks. Asterisk means it's statistically significant. That if you get tolerance, that leads to creative people are educated, that then the creatives start developing technology, and then that raises everyone's incomes. So that's the idea. And not everyone agrees with Richard Florida. So Jamie Peck up in Vancouver wrote a scathing review of this theory. He calls Florida a neoliberal, which is to say that he's basically does not believe that the government, should have a predominant role. That regional growth should be more market oriented. Um, there were other criticisms of Florida's theory. The economic conservative argument says, well, sorry, Richard Florida, it really doesn't matter what kind of human capital. Any human capital increase should lead to regional development, and that can be summed up as skills, sun, and sprawl. The three things that lead regions to grow: skilled workforce, sunny weather, and sprawl, which is to say affordable housing that people want to live in. Now, he, of course, is also, Florida also gets criticism from social conservatives who are skeptical about immigration or same sex relationships, that maybe would question the need for tolerance. And then, of course, what kind of philosophy is Jamie Peck speaking from? That's something you have to infer. He doesn't come out as a particular, but I gave you a little hint on the slide. Oh, before I move on, Peck also critiques Jennifer Granholm's Cool Cities initiative, and that was inspired by Richard Florida's work. He actually came to Michigan and did a lot of consulting. And this was a mini grant program for cities to do creative, placemaking activities like murals, parks, cultural programming to attract super creatives. So there's other work that has examined, can we test the creative capital thesis? Can we test the human capital and social capital all at the same time? And one of the places that generates social capital is churches. And this one article, it takes a village, looks at church membership as a proxy for bonding social capital. And so the question then is bonding social capital a job killer? In other words, does it reduce economic growth? Which I wrote, is Jesus a job killer? And then Peck also questions this creative class idea that it's like a cargo cult in which airstrips are laid out in the jungle hoping that an aircraft passes by. What he's saying is that these creative interventions assumes that if you build an airstrip of creativity, then creative people will land, and that this is, another variation of, this kind of optimistic, market-oriented view that Peck is criticizing. So here's the results from the village study. So the human capital measure is the percent of people who have a bachelor's degree. The intellectual capital is some measure of degrees granted by universities. Social capital, we have the bonding social capital is a church membership, and then the bridging is, of course, some measure of being connected to different organizations. And then there's some control variables. And if you look, when you control for regional variation, human capital, intellectual capital, and social capital, the effect of the creative class vanishes. And you see that the highest effect size for job growth is on human capital, both for wages and for job growth. And so that suggests then that if you want to grow the economy, that you should invest in human capital. Now, the result on social capital is interesting in that it is negative. And so it's important to notice that it's negative on bonding social capital. And then there's no statistical effect for bridging. And so, one thing is that the right measure? And, what does it mean that the higher church attendance, the lower job growth, that I think is subject to debate. But also think about broader questions about what happens when you have wage increases and job growth broadly. And that's what Richard Florida picks up in his sequel, where one day he wakes up and says, "No, Jamie Peck, I'm not a neoliberal. In fact, I'm a revolutionary Marxist, and I used to wear a beret." He actually said something to that effect in an interview. And so he thinks the new problem is the new urban crisis is inequality. And you have a winner-take-all urbanism. There's a gap between the superstar cities and the rest. That you have a gentrification crisis. You have a disappearing middle class. You have poverty moving out to the suburbs because low-income people can't afford to live in the cities. And you have urbanization without growth, which is to say that population isn't changing much, but more places are being urbanized. So fewer people in, the housing stock. And then he has some proposed solutions. Some of them are more technocratic that have to do with zoning and taxation. He's trying to get back to this idea of clustering, subsidies for affordable housing, minimum wage, increase in minimum wage, investing in people and places, which is to say a place-based initiative. And then this has to be a global effort, and it has to involve empowerment. So that's, I think, where social work could come in. This you can do at your leisure. Try to figure out the theory or ideology to the authors that we've read or been cited. So in summary, human capital, social capital, and creative capital are theorized to produce economic growth. But economic growth is often coupled with income and health inequality. And urban economics demonstrates how firms might co-locate in a community that produces growth. Next week, we'll be reading about place-based initiatives. And of course, FICON is a conference of organizations that do place-based initiatives, so it is very appropriate that we do that.